In this lecture presentation, we're going to be discussing the relationship between thought and language. As always, I recommend that you have the slides nearby so that you can fill in the blanks and take notes as we proceed through the slides. A lot of what we'll be discussing in this lecture presentation relates to the field of psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics is the field of psychology that studies the use of language, particularly how we acquire and use language. Language is subdivided into two categories: the underlying representation and the surface structure. The underlying representation is the meaning of the communication. It is what you are trying to communicate. The surface structure are the sounds or the shapes of that communication. When we communicate out loud through the spoken word, sounds are the surface structure. When we write words down, the surface structure becomes the shapes of the letters themselves. Essentially, the underlying representation is the thought you want to get across to the other person, and the surface structure are the sounds or the shapes that you use to do so. Of course, language is the most used medium for communication, but it's not the only way we communicate our thoughts and feelings. Can you think of any other ways we communicate that does not involve words? Some common answers are dance, art, and music, without lyrics, of course. When it comes to psycholinguistics, there are numerous benefits that have been demonstrated through research in terms of the bilingual brain. Many of you in this course may be bilingual, and you should know that it's a massive advantage to be bilingual, not only in terms of being able to communicate with people who speak multiple languages, but also in terms of the impact it has on the brain itself. Those of you who like to pause the recording to watch videos might pause here to watch the video, The Benefits of a Bilingual Brain. I do want to note that bilingual does not have to refer to two separate languages. Code switching, where different forms of the same language are used in different contexts, also has benefits that are similar to being bilingual. For example, if you use different forms of English when you're with your friends or family compared to when you're writing an academic paper, that form of code switching also challenges the brain in excellent ways and provides many benefits. So what do we mean when we refer to communication and comprehension? If you look at the 3 steps below and you read them from left to right, that demonstrates communication. So it starts with the thought in the mind of the sender. This is the deep structure that the sender is intending to communicate. The sender then chooses words, phrases, and sentences to express their thought. From there, speech sounds and shapes of letters, otherwise known as surface structures, are chosen to create those words, phrases, and sentences. Now, what about comprehension? Comprehension goes in the opposite direction. So the listener would first be exposed to the speech sounds and shapes of letters, the surface structure. From there, they would be able to evaluate the words, phrases, sentences used to express thought by the sender. In a perfect world, from there, the listener would be able to know the thought in the mind of the sender. That is, if all goes well, comprehension should involve the listener being able to comprehend the thought in the mind of the sender. Mental models affect how we receive information. That is, mental models affect our comprehension. For example, 21% of 2,000 adults who were surveyed reported that the sun revolves around the earth. Hopefully, many of you understand that this is incorrect, that in reality, the sun does not revolve around the earth, but rather, we revolve around the sun. How do so many adults in the United States get this wrong? 21% is 1 in 5. It's likely because we develop mental models based on our experiences, and because the sun appears to rotate around the earth, it's easy to comprehend that as fact or to assume that that's fact rather than to understand that it is not the way that we actually experience it to be. So mental models serve as one way that we get information wrong. Ambiguous language is another way that we make mistakes in terms of comprehension. Ambiguous language refers to terms, sentences, or phrases that have more than one possible meaning or interpretation. When it comes to ambiguous language, the surface structure has more than one meaning or more than one underlying representation. Problems in communication when it comes to ambiguous language could be due to any combination of the sender's thinking, the sender's use of language, the receiver's use of language, or the receiver's thinking. For example, when my cousin was much younger and barely able to talk, I babysat him for the first time. When he woke up from his nap, a bit surprised to see me, he asked for cold milk. I went to the fridge and I poured milk into his bottle and handed it to him. Immediately I realized this was not what he wanted. He handed it back and he said cold milk again. This time, I put ice in the milk. Maybe that would make it colder. At this point, he's more frustrated and he throws the bottle on the ground. I don't know what to do at this point, so I put him in his stroller and I take him on a little walk. As we pass a store, he starts pointing inside. Long story short, he found what he was looking for, which was an ice cream sandwich. When we got back to the house and his mom came home a couple hours later, she asked how it went. I told her the story of my misunderstanding of cold milk. She was so apologetic because she had forgot to mention that he always refers to ice cream sandwiches as cold milk, and she had promised him one when he woke up from his nap. In this case, you could say that the problem was on my end because I did not have the correct use of language in terms of how he used the term. You could also say that it was on his end, the sender's use of language. When you're battling with a toddler, it doesn't really matter whose fault it is. Some other examples of ambiguous language might be the statement, "The old men and women left the room." Does that mean the old men and all of the women left the room? Or does old refer to the men and the women? What about "I saw her duck"? Does she have a pet duck? Or did she duck to get out of the way? Students hate boring professors. Now that's when we can use some context clues to decipher. It's probably more likely that students dislike professors who are boring than students being very concerned about boring their professors. Happily they left. Who's happy about it? Are you glad that they left, or are they glad they left? They hit the man with the cane. Did the man who was hit have a cane, or did they hit the man with a cane? I saw the man with the binoculars. Was the man holding binoculars, or did you see him using yours? They are hunting dogs. Are they? Are they out hunting dogs, or are these dogs who like to hunt? When we're faced with ambiguous language or other difficulties in communication, we often have to make inferences about what the person means. What we infer in a given situation influences our comprehension. We have to use other information, sometimes context clues, to help figure out what the person is trying to communicate. And unfortunately, we often get it wrong. And oftentimes, we're unaware that we're wrong. Weasel phrases are used quite often, and they capitalize on inference. Weasel phrases are used to persuade the listener towards a desired conclusion. Weasel phrases, essentially, are phrases that are used to infer something that is not true by suggesting that something specific has been said, when in fact the words are ambiguous. For example, consuming fiber is an important part of a weight loss system. Sounds really compelling. Sounds like they're telling you that fiber will help you lose weight. They can't come out and say that because the research doesn't directly support it. So instead they use a weasel phrase like, an important part of, because they know that you'll remember the connection of fiber and weight loss and not the complete sentence that was shared. Unfortunately, we have better memories for our implied meaning than the actual statements. So what we infer tends to stick with us more than what was actually said. This is used quite often in advertisements and commercials. They rely on inference because they can't tell you something that is not true. For example, the American Express Traveler's Check commercial shows a couple who lost their traveler's checks and are distressed until they find out that lost American Express traveler's checks can be refunded. This implies that other traveler checks brands will not or may not refund lost traveling checks. Don't leave home without them reinforces the idea that you need them and that they're dependable, safe, and reliable ways to travel with money. The trick here is that this is the same with all travelers' checks, but they don't want to come out and tell you that. Another example are Listerine commercials. My favorite is the Listerine commercial that shows the mother dressing her children in warm clothes and discussing how she hates having scratchy sore throats and runny noses. And then, to keep her family healthy, she makes sure they eat right, get plenty of rest and exercise, and gargle with Listerine. Of course, she can't tell you that Listerine will prevent or cure sore throats, runny noses, colds, or any other ills associated with those winter illnesses. So, they structure the commercial around the intention of you inferring that information. They hope that the next time you're at the store, you'll think being a good mother means buying Listerine. Another example are airlines, who state nobody beats our fare. And that may be true because generally all the fares are about the same. But they don't want to say that because that's not going to get you to buy a flight from them. Again, people remember the applied meaning of a message much better than the actual statements made. So meaningful information is just generally remembered better than verbatim statements. Our memories, therefore, depend on the interpretation we give it at the time. Now that we know a bit about how communication can go wrong, let's talk about some rules for clear communication. First, you want to give the receiver the information that they want or expect to hear. It's really important that the level, the type, and the quantity of information depend on the purpose of communication. For example, if you're on a trip in Europe and someone asks where you're from, it probably wouldn't make sense to say Fullerton. You might say the United States or California, maybe even Southern California. If you met somebody in New York, saying you're from the United States probably wouldn't make sense. So you might say California, Southern California, maybe even Orange County. If you met someone who lived in Orange County, it would make sense to tell them the city that you live. Next, don't share what the receiver already knows about the subject. A little bit of review is okay, but you don't want to bore somebody with giving them a review of everything they already know. Too much new information and the person will be overwhelmed and might get lost. Too little and they're likely to get bored and zone out. Next, adapt your communication style to the intended listener. That means taking into consideration things like their knowledge on the subject, their age, their status. Their beliefs, knowledge, and expectations will determine what and how much you should say for the intended purpose of the conversation. Next, tell the truth. It's really important that when sharing information, that you're always speaking from truth. Listeners suspect when they're being lied to, and from there, begin to scrutinize all aspects of communication, which actually breaks down the communication process. Negation, when somebody denies something, particularly something plausible, leads the listener to infer the plausibility of that which was denied. For example, when Nixon said, "I am not a crook," people immediately began to question, why would he say such a thing? A lot of people have the same response to people who say, "I'm not a cheater," or "I would never cheat." Generally, people who have never cheated and don't suspect that they ever would don't feel the need to say that about themselves. Next, use simple, straightforward communication style as much as possible. It actually makes sense to simplify information. People who try to, quote, sound smart, unquote, generally end up having the opposite effect. Those of you who have seen the Friends episode where Joey writes the letter for the adoption agency know what I'm talking about. Last, it's important to use manner and/or context to clarify intended meaning. There's a lot we can do to give clues to somebody about what we mean, and this is especially important for ambiguous statements. For example, if somebody asks me how my day's going and I say, it's going really well, versus, it's going really well, you know I mean two different things. I use the same words, but the way I use them differed. Sarcasm depends on using manner to clarify context. We can also use things like tone of voice, expressions, body language, and emojis, which is why I oftentimes will use a happy face to clarify when I'm sending a text that might come across as cold and I don't intend it to clarify the fact that this is a short, quick text, but I'm in a good mood and I mean well. I want you to think about the sentence, she told him that she loved him, to understand how even just intonation can make a big impact in regards to comprehension. What happens when we stress a different word each time? Is there a difference between she told him that she loved him, 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 she told him that she loved him? Can you see how just changing where I put the emphasis changed the meaning? Another way we can improve communication is through the use of analogies. Analogies can be used to better understand information by relating it to something that's well known or familiar. Analogies are essentially a comparison between two things that are typically used for explanation or clarification. Good analogies compare two things based on their underlying structures, not similar surface or superficial characteristics. So a poor analogy would be, her eyes were like two brown circles with big black dots in the center. That's comparing to surface characteristics. A good analogy would be, an atom is like a miniature solar system, or the circulatory system is like a railway. Can you see how by comparing an atom to a miniature solar system, you immediately know something about an atom that perhaps you didn't know before? Experts use analogies often because they're so powerful in not only teaching concepts, but solving problems as well. Analogies are very commonly used for innovation as well as for persuasion. We'll talk about analogies in terms of innovation quite a bit towards the end of this course. One example that we will talk about later on is the use of analogies from nature to innovate. For example, the realization of how different types of mussels and barnacles adhere under the water created an analogy for the wet environment of the mouth and led to the development of dental glue. Analogies can be used to enhance persuasion as well. For example, chains could be used to describe missing links of evidence. For example, a chain link could be used to describe evidence where each chain link leads to the next. Can you see how that is different than an analogy to a rope, where there are many, many strands, and perhaps one weak strand of a rope would not break the rope, whereas one broken link would break the rope? In a courtroom, using this analogy could persuade the jury to think differently about one weak link of evidence versus one weak strand of a rope. In World War II, Hitler also used analogies for persuasive effect and helped justify his choices by creating analogies between Jews and rats. Speaking of war and persuasion, Another way analogies could be used is by comparing more modern wars to World War II versus Vietnam. Individuals who might be persuading you to believe that our more modern wars are justified are more likely to compare them to World War II versus Vietnam, which was unpopular, protracted, and generally considered to have been a poor choice in American history. Analogies aren't only used for innovation and persuasion, of course. They're also used just to communicate ideas, and again, for the purpose of explanation and clarification quite often as well. The picture at the bottom says life is like a box of terrible analogies, which is a bit of a rephrase from a quote from Forrest Gump, when life was compared to a box of chocolates. Think about that analogy for a minute. What did Forrest Gump mean when he compared life to chocolates? Was he comparing the surface structure, life is brown, life is dark? Or was he comparing the underlying meaning, life is unpredictable, you don't know what you're going to get in a box of chocolates? So we've established by now that words have powerful meaning and that those meanings influence how we think, and vice versa. How we think is influenced by our language. For example, alcoholism could be viewed as a disease or as a series of poor choices. Depending on how you define and conceptualize alcoholism, your views on various policies and your interactions with individuals who may have experienced alcoholism will differ. Another example is in terms of homosexuality, which was actually a mental illness until 1973. This leads me to an important point about who gets to define the terms that we use in our language. In the case of homosexuality, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, got to define the term. Thankfully, they came to their senses in 1973, and it has been no longer considered any kind of mental health condition since then. In the most recent version of the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual therapists use to diagnose clients, there was a lot of question about whether hypochondriasis, someone who is worried about their health, should be considered an anxiety disorder. They determined that it should, and it's now called illness anxiety disorder. Words have cognitive and emotional meanings, and companies and products have used that to their advantage for a very long time. When you hear mother's cookies, there's a warm and comforting association. However, if we're being realistic, we know mother's cookies are made in a giant factory, just like all of the other cookies. Lean cuisine capitalizes on the fact that it's not only going to help you have a lean body, but it's high-end cuisine as well. Nature Valley, which is covered in sugar and various oils and not necessarily healthy for you, leads the consumer to think of nature, which by definition we associate with being good for you. Sprint sounds like fast technology. Evernote, don't you want to hold on to those notes forever? Emotionally laden words also help with memory and help initiate action. They do this because they elicit strong images, which lead to strong responses. Politicians and the media deliberately choose labels based on the impact they want to have. For example, if they want you to believe that this individual who is being held against their will is a detainee, they don't necessarily think that we should run in and save them. Hostage has a very different connotation. When we hear hostage, we do start to think about rescue efforts. Same goes with climate change versus climate crisis. Climate crisis has a much more powerful impact and is a term that more and more people are using to help people understand that this is something that we really need to take note of and do something about. Definitions change over time and they're culturally specific. Etymology, which is the study of word origins, might be helpful for the SATs, but it's generally not helpful for understanding contemporary definitions. Words change over time. For example, egregious used to mean good, but now it means bad. Senile used to mean old in general, and now it refers to dementia. Silly used to mean worthy, and now it means foolish. Gay is another example of a word that has changed meaning over time. It used to mean playful, and now refers to homosexuality. Those of you who like to pause the recording to watch the videos might consider pausing here to watch both how language shapes the way we think, which relates to the material on this slide, as well as the video Rebranding Shame that relates to what we'll discuss next. So how do labels and categories affect how we think? First, labels and categories make inferences possible, which is something we were talking about just a few slides ago. For example, if you found a pee spot next to the couch, your category of your family members probably leads you to believe that it wasn't one of them. However, your category of animals might suggest that it's probably your family dog because the rest of your family's potty trained. Another way that labels affect how we think is through the labeling of various positions on an issue. For example, there's a big impact difference between the term pro-life and anti-choice. And it's absolutely no coincidence that individuals who are against abortion chose the term pro-life over the term anti-choice. Pro-life has a positive spin to it, whereas anti-choice certainly doesn't. Categorization is a really powerful cognitive economy strategy, and essentially what that means is that it helps reduce mental workload and also helps to reduce our sense of uncertainty in the world because it provides this sense of predictability instead. Categorical thinking, as great as it can be in some ways, also underlies the development and maintenance of stereotypes. For example, let's say you came across a crying baby. If there was no such thing as a category, and you just came across this crying, helpless thing that seemed to be alive on the ground, you wouldn't know what to do. But because you have the category of baby in your mind, you could probably narrow down what this baby needs to a handful of options. Is the baby hungry? Is its diaper dirty? Does it need to be cuddled and rocked? Categories do provide us a lot of helpful information. A prototype is the best example of a category. Prototypes tend to be the first example you think of when you think of that category. It's the first thing that comes to mind and is relatively standard within a culture. If you look at the pictures in the right-hand column, you'll see 3 different houses. One of those best matches your prototype of a house. Of course, it might not be perfect. For me, it's the one in the middle. Even the windows look similar to the ones I would draw as a kid. Square, 2 lines dividing them, whoop, 4 windows. Now, depending on where you grew up, you might see the one on the top or the bottom as more prototypical for you. Let's do an activity to help you identify your prototypes. I want you to write down the first example that comes to mind for the next 10 categories that I list. First, a bird. A color. A type of triangle, either a picture or the name. 4, a motor vehicle. 5, a sentence. 6, a hero. 7, a heroic action. 8, a game. 9, a philosopher. And 10, a writer. Generally, when I've done these in class, there's a lot of consistency across student responses. Birds tend to be birds that we typically see. Seagulls, for example, robins, blue jays, particularly those that share sports teams' names, are very common answers. Eagles and falcons are very common as well. What's not very common? Emu, ostrich, penguin. They're not what we think about when we typically think about birds. Color is generally a color of the rainbow: black, white, brown, pink. Unless you have a favorite color that differs from that, those are by far the most common answers. Triangle, almost always isosceles or equilateral. That probably has to do with the fact that many people don't know of another triangle, except potentially a right triangle. Motor vehicle, usually it's a car you drive, a car you wish you drove, or a car that you see often. What is it usually not, unless you happen to drive one or be interested? An RV, a motorcycle. A sentence usually short and declarative. I love spaghetti. A hero, some kind of person who's a first responder, is very, very common, or a parent or grandparent. A heroic action, saving a life. A game, usually it's a favorite board game or a sports game, but what it's not usually is something that you don't play. A philosopher, usually one of the classics, like Socrates. And a writer, usually it's your favorite or somebody you were forced to read that you really didn't like, and that stands out. Prototypes definitely influence the way we think. And one example of that was one of the earliest in-class examples that we did, which was a riddle. If you remember, the neurosurgeon was the mom in that example. Why is that hard for some people to come up with? Because our prototype of a neurosurgeon is male. Let's move on to semantic slanting, anchors, and framing. Semantic slanting is when an individual uses strong verbs or adjectives to slant the way the reader or listener views the product. It's a strategy for directing the listener's thoughts. They deliberately use word choices that increase the likelihood of a specific emotional response or belief in the listener. Some examples might be using the term odor versus the term aroma, since odor has a negative connotation and aroma has a positive one. Or a juicy burger versus a greasy burger. On the outside, they might look the same. But if I'm Burger King and I'm advertising my newest burger, juicy is a much better word. But if I'm Subway, a greasy burger makes more sense. Another way in which this has impact is in terms of assessment as therapists. In a first session, generally we ask a lot of questions about substance use to get an idea of what types of substances the individual uses and how often. For a long time, I was a therapist in a community college health center, and I found that when I asked, "Do you use substances?" the answer was often no. When I changed that question to, "How often do you use substances?" I almost always got an answer back. Even better, I might say, "How often do you smoke pot? Every day? Twice a day?" That leads the listener to feel comfortable with the fact that I am clearly assuming that they use the substance and that they use it often. So it's easier for them to say, "Oh no, not every day, maybe every other day," compared to if I said, "Do you smoke pot?" at which point every other day might feel like a risk to confess. When it comes to anchoring, the anchor essentially serves as the figure at the beginning and then becomes the point of comparison. So, in terms of borrowing money, for example, if you needed to borrow $100 from your parents and you asked for $100, that might seem like a lot of money. But what if you said you needed to borrow $500? Doesn't that make 100 seem a lot more reasonable? The Social Security sweater example is from a research study. This proved that anchoring doesn't even have to be deliberate or meaningful. In this study, they had students write down the last 2 digits of their Social Security number and then asked them to write down how much they'd be willing to pay for a sweater. Individuals who had higher numbers in terms of their last 2 digits of their Social Security number said they were willing to pay more for a sweater than those with lower numbers. Framing is similar to semantic slanting, but in the case of framing, the structure is deliberately intended to influence someone's decision. So, framing basically means framing the decision in such a way that it increases the likelihood of that person making the desirable choice or landing on the desired perspective. Framing capitalizes on risk aversion. Risk aversion is basically our inherent sense as humans that we prefer to stay away from things that are risky. Framing also sets an anchor for interpretation, so that the person has that point of comparison to go back to. In terms of framing examples, the save versus kill dilemma. Imagine that the US is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual disease. I promise This example I've been using for years, even though it seems particularly apropos right now. So, this unusual disease is expected to kill 600 people. 4 alternative programs have been developed to combat the disease. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the program are as follows. 1, 200 people will be saved. 2, a third probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. 3, 400 people will die. And 4, 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. When they gave this problem to college students, they only gave them 2 options at a time. The students who were given the option between 200 people will be saved and 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved, 72% chose 1, 200 people will be saved. In the second group that were given the second 2 choices, 400 people will die versus 1/3 probability that nobody will die and 2/3 probability that 600 people will die, 78% chose 2, 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Essentially, these are saying the exact same thing. 200 people will be saved and 400 people will die is the same statement when there are 600 people. However, when given the choice between phrasing about saving people, people prefer that option. When it is phrased as how many people will die, people choose the other option. Essentially, when a statement is phrased in terms of loss, it's judged more negatively than a mathematically identical statement that is phrased in terms of gain. The other framing example, the National Daycare Program. Think for a moment how you might respond. Are you in favor of a national program that ensures good quality, affordable daycare for infants and young children whose parents work outside of the home? Now compare that to, are you in favor of programs that are paid for with your tax dollars that place infants and young children in childcare institutions for 9 to 10 hours each day without their parents? Now, you might have said yes to both, but I imagine some of you had different feelings about the first statement compared to the second statement, even though they're essentially about the same thing. Thoughts and decisions are also affected by contrast and context effects. Contrast and context effects refer to the fact that even when the evaluator and the object stays the same, the frame of reference can change the person's perspective. For example, maybe you think stealing a server's tip is a huge infraction, but when you compare it to murder, does it seem as bad? Or perhaps you recently moved into a new apartment. If you just moved out of a rather large home, perhaps it feels really small and confining. Or did you just move out of a teeny tiny studio? Then perhaps it feels luxurious. If you ask that fish in the bowl how small his bowl is, it probably depends on the bowl he had before. Maybe this one has slightly more room than the last one. Or perhaps he used to be in a big bowl and now he feels really constricted. Moving on to vagueness, euphemism, and reification. Vagueness is when communication lacks the precision necessary for the intended purpose. For example, many of you have probably seen the signs that say California law requires posting a warning sign in regards to cancer-causing chemicals. But because they don't specify the exact likelihood of developing cancer or the specific chemicals you might be exposed to or any other really helpful information, it's hard to draw a meaningful estimate of risk, and therefore people generally disregard it. Vagueness is also used to be socially polite or used when we're discussing unpleasant situations or issues. For example, if somebody asks, "Why did you get a divorce?" listing off all of the reasons might not be socially appropriate, particularly if you don't really know the person asking. A common answer would be, "It just didn't work out," or, "Well, we're just incompatible." Some other examples of vagueness might be saying that you have health issues, or telling someone you've changed. I live down the street. We're leaving in the morning. What time in the morning? How about calling out from work because you're feeling ill? What does that mean? Euphemisms. Euphemisms are substitutions of more desirable and/or less offensive terms, and they're generally used to reduce the negative emotion that's associated with discussing an issue. For example, rather than saying died, people commonly say passed away. Instead of sex education, people who are uncomfortable with that tend to refer to as family education. Body parts, particularly in children, use nicknames commonly, like a wee-wee. Instead of discussing the exact thing occurring in a bathroom, we might say, use the restroom. Instead of fired, you might refer to it as being let go. Other euphemisms that we might use would be the birds and the bees rather than sex, or in a better place rather than dying. They slept together rather than sex, or people who live on the streets rather than people who are homeless, or a dog that was sent to the farm or was put to sleep. Reification is referring to and treating something that is abstract as though it's concrete. So it's essentially ascribing some definitive value or some form to something that is immaterial. For example, your ego. We talk about our ego as though it's a concrete thing, right? My bruised ego. Where is your ego? How did you bruise it? Your conscience. Can your conscience really tell you anything? Love. Can love find you? Who's Mother Nature? Who's Father Time? Can you grab life by the horns? Can your bed call you? The last terms related to thought and language that we'll discuss in this lecture presentation are ambiguity, equivocation, and bureaucratese. Ambiguity, as we've already discussed, is when there are multiple meanings to a given statement, and that statement can be clarified by context. For example, if I say Mary had a little lamb, you don't know if I mean lamb, an animal, or lamb, like the meat, which of course also comes from the animal. So the following statement clarifies the intended meaning. Mary had a little lamb, it followed her to school, tells us something very different than Mary had a little lamb and then a little broccoli. Another example that was discussed in your textbook of ambiguity is the statement about the FBI border. In this example, the FBI director told an employee to watch the borders. In this case, the FBI director meant the margins of the document. But unfortunately, the ambiguous statement led the individual to misinterpret and instead created a special alert along the Canada-US and the Mexico-US borders. Another example, I saw a man on a hill with a telescope. Now, you probably had an immediate interpretation of this statement. It could mean a lot of things. There's a man on a hill, and I'm watching him with my telescope. There's a man on a hill who I'm seeing, and he has a telescope. There's a man, and he's on a hill that also has a telescope on it. I'm on a hill, and I saw a man using a telescope. There's a man on a hill, and I'm sawing him with a telescope. Let's hope it's not that last one. Some other examples of ambiguity might be 8 people left. 8 people left the room, or 8 people are left in the room. He gave her cat food. He gave her cat some food, or he gave her some cat food. My sister was on the phone. Was your sister on the phone and that's why you couldn't use it, or were you talking to your sister on the phone? I could go on and on with examples of ambiguity, but I think you get the point. Moving on to equivocation. Equivocation tends to be a difficult concept for a lot of students. To equivocate is to change meaning during a discussion. Equivocation capitalizes on ambiguity. So one example that is quite popular is man is the only rational animal, no woman is a man, and therefore no woman is rational. Can you see how the term changed meaning midway? Man is the only rational animal is using man to mean human. No woman is a man is now talking about biological sex. The conclusion, therefore, is completely illogical. Other equivocation examples. People should have rights. You were not right about that argument, therefore you have violated my rights. The badger lives at the bank. The bank is on Downing Street, so the badger lives on Downing Street. Silence is golden. Gold is worth money, therefore it's worth money to be quiet. All trees have bark. My dog barks, therefore my dog is a tree. Bureaucratese is when formal and technical language that is unfamiliar to the audience hinders understanding. And I put hinders in bold because I really want to highlight the fact that it is only bureaucratese if the style and language hinders the listener or the reader's understanding. When formal and technical language is used appropriately, it is not bureaucratese. For example, contracts. To a lawyer, contracts are not bureaucratese. But to me, and I imagine to most of you, contracts certainly do qualify as bureaucratese. I don't know about you, but I can't say that I understand the entire contract. Same goes with terms and conditions agreements. Military terminology, royal ceremonies, or declaration forms with international flights. For the last 3 slides of this lecture presentation, we're going to briefly cover some strategies to help improve comprehension, starting with the SQ3R approach. SQ3R stands for survey, question, read, recite, and review. Survey is to skim the framework of what you're about to learn. You might do this by reviewing the table of contents or briefly looking through what you're about to read. Next, question. I like to turn headings into questions or subheadings into questions, but you can create questions in any way that you like as long as they relate to what you're about to learn. Next, read. This is where you actually do the reading or the viewing in the case of videos. It's important to take notes and to highlight while you're reading or take notes while you're watching a video. Next, recite. Here you're going to answer the questions you created in the question step. It's really important that you do this in your own words. It's also important that you either do it aloud or on paper. Don't give yourself a chance to cheat yourself. Lastly, review. And as we've talked about before, you want to review until material is overlearned, not the first time you get through it without having problems. Over and over again in spaced out study sessions until it becomes automatic and at least less effortful. Reciprocal peer questioning is when learners take turns asking and answering thoughtful questions about material. It helps improve recall, and it helps generate multiple retrieval cues, which can really help during an exam. Practice at retrieval is the #1 variable in promoting long-term retention. The more you can do it with yourself and with others, the more likely you are to have that information available when you need it. There are generic questions for reciprocal peer questioning that you can use in your textbook on pages 154 to 155, and we'll also talk about some guiding questions on the final slide. Before we get to the guiding questions, I briefly want to cover graphic organizers. There are many different types of graphic organizers, and this slide only presents 4 of them. Graphic organizers are helpful because they make abstract concepts more concrete. They help transform text into explicit spatial representations, and they require the learner to relate new information to prior knowledge, which helps make information more meaningful and more memorable. It can also be really helpful in writing processes and for brainstorming and organization. Let's start with a linear array. Linear arrays are really great when there's a line of events. That could be time-ordered, for example, the digestive system, the mouth, then to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the small intestines, etc. Or gradations, for example, with vocabulary and feeling words. Afraid, there are a lot of different synonyms for. It might be unsure, then to timid, to worried, to threatened, to panicked, to petrified. Hierarchies are good for topics where information is organized according to class inclusion rules. For example, a family tree, an organizational chart for a business, or a table of contents that lists chapters and then subheadings for those chapters. Networks work well because they require you to consider the nature of the relationship among concepts. And you can actually categorize relationships into 6 possible types that are referred to as links. These are part of, type of, leads to, analogy or is like, characteristic of or feature of, and evidence that. Trying to use these links has been shown to improve comprehension. Networks are what are used to create mind maps as well. Lastly, matrices. Unfortunately, there was no great icon for this, so I used what looks like a checklist. In reality, matrices look more like grids. Matrices are useful when there's a judgment to make about a product or a course of action that differ among multiple dimensions. They're used in Consumer Report magazine, which you may have seen, that lists all of the different variables and where the various products fall in terms of those variables or dimensions. The commonalities and the distinctions emerge from the chart. For example, it might be comparing multiple types of cars by their gas mileage, their price, what their resale value may be, and what kinds of added features they have available. Our last slide for today is a list of guiding questions. These blanks are left intentionally blank because they're meant to be filled with whatever term applies to what you're trying to learn. This is a really excellent way to study for your exam. Let's start with the first question. What is a new example of? So for example, you might say, what's a new example of ambiguity? One that hasn't been given in this lecture yet. How does blank apply to everyday life? How does bureaucratese apply to everyday life? What are the implications of? Maybe what are the implications of labels and categories? What are the strengths and weaknesses of using analogies for communication? What is blank analogous to? Or how are they similar or different? Maybe what is communication analogous to? And how is it similar or different to comprehension? What do we already know about the meaning of words? How does blank affect blank? How do anchors affect framing? Why or how is blank important? Why or how is inference important? And then lastly, what is the meaning of blank? And here you might say, what is the meaning of equivocation? Of course, you can use these questions over and over again, and you just change how you fill in the blank. I hope you find it useful in studying for your exam.